Dorian Brandt's morning at JFK Airport should have been just like any other. With his sharp suit and polished demeanor, he was prepared for his flight to San Francisco, where he was scheduled to deliver the keynote at the Western Produce Sustainability Summit. At 58, Dorian had made this journey countless times, but this time was different. As he approached Gate 17, ready to board his first-class seat, the young gate agent looked at him with an expression of doubt, as if questioning his right to be there. The tension was subtle, yet undeniable, a moment that would spark a quiet but powerful. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. Dorian stood at the counter, his heart steady, his mind focused. The young gate agent, Haley, scanned his first-class boarding pass but hesitated, her eyes flicking between the pass and Dorian, a hint of uncertainty flickering behind her professional facade. The seconds stretched, and in that moment Dorian felt something familiar. It wasn't the first time his presence had been questioned, but it was the first time in so many years that he'd felt the sting of being overlooked, of being viewed as an outsider in a world he had worked so hard to claim as his own. "This lane is for premium passengers only," she said, her voice sharp, as if she needed to assert authority. The words hung in the air, their bite unmistakable. "Dorian." "Ever." Tom simply nodded. "I know," he said, keeping his voice even. He watched her closely, his gaze unwavering. He had been in this position before, where his worth was questioned not by anything he did, but by assumptions others made based on their perception of who belonged and who didn't. Haley blinked, and then her hand moved over the scanner but didn't click the button. Instead, she shifted her gaze again, first to the boarding pass, then to a colleague behind her. Dorian felt the weight of the moment as if the air around him had thickened. He had built an empire, signed multi-million-dollar contracts, yet here, in this small corner of an airport, he was nothing more than a black man with a first-class ticket. The thought stung, but he swallowed the emotion. This wasn't the place for it. He wasn't going to make a scene. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Haley said, her voice wavering slightly now. Dorian raised an eyebrow. This wasn't part, the usual procedure. He had traveled enough to know the drill. A scan of the pass, and that was it. No ID required. But today it felt like an interrogation, a subtle game of prove yourself that Dorian was all too familiar with. "You don't usually ask for ID when scanning a pass," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. There was no anger in his tone, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew this moment all too well. Haley hesitated, clearly caught between her training and her instinct. She looked at the ID, unsure of what to do with it. It wasn't just her confusion that bothered Dorian. It was the underlying question, the unspoken, "Are you really who you say you are?" "Just a security measure," she muttered, placing his ID on the desk without scanning it. Dorian's patience was infinite. He wasn't going to argue, wasn't going to raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made the call. He wasn't going to let this moment escalate any further. But there was something else, something deeper that stirred inside him as the gate agent walked away. The moment she turned her back, he could almost hear the silent judgment in the air. The assumption that, despite all his success, he didn't belong in the first-class lane. "Yeah, I'm standing at JFK Gate 17, he said to Maggie, his assistant, the only person who knew exactly what needed to happen next. His words were calm, but there was an edge to them, the kind of edge born of years of enduring these moments without ever flinching. The call wasn't to complain, it was a warning. This wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger. This was about a system, a culture that needed to change. Dorian stood by the gate, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. But inside, a quiet storm was building. Maggie's voice came through clearly on the line. "Got it, I'll flag it, but do you want me to escalate it to corporate right now?" Dorian didn't hesitate. "No, just flag it for now. They're about to realize their mistake, but I'll let them do it quietly. Let's see how they handle this." His voice was soft, measured, but underneath the calm, there was a growing sense of inevitability. He stood there, watching Haley as she shuffled nervously behind the counter, her movements betraying her uncertainty. It was as though the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. The small crowd of passengers in the first-class line had started to murmur, noticing the delay. They glanced at Dorian with curiosity, some with slight suspicion, others clearly uncomfortable with the awkward pause in the boarding process. Dorian didn't turn to look at them. His focus remained locked on the gate agent, who now seemed to be waiting for something, anything that might resolve this impasse. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated. Not yet. Instead, there was a quiet strength that ran through him. The kind that only came from years of being tested, of facing obstacles that had nothing to do with merit or capability. Dorian knew this moment was as much about power as it was about perception. And he knew something most people didn't. Real power doesn't shout. It stays calm, quiet, and waits. Haley leaned into her microphone, speaking into it softly. "We're just working through a minor issue," she said, her voice laced with tension. Her words clearly meant to assure the passengers, but no one was buying it. A businessman in a gray sweater, who had been quietly observing the scene, leaned forward to whisper to his neighbor, "Is he causing trouble or something?" The question hung in the air like a jarring note in a symphony. Dorian heard the whisper but didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He wasn't there to explain himself. He wasn't going to dignify that kind of question with an answer. What was the point? Everyone at that gate knew exactly who he was, whether they wanted to admit it or not. They might not recognize his face or his name, but he represented something far bigger than the fleeting judgment of a gate agent. Maggie's voice broke through the silence again, steady and professional. "I've flagged it, but we're also pulling in legal just in case. You want me to keep the pressure on?" "Yes," Dorian said, his voice dropping even lower. "Let's make sure they understand what they're dealing with. This isn't just about me." His words weren't a threat. They weren't even a demand. They were simply a statement of fact. He had built his business on integrity, on doing things right. But he had also learned how to handle moments like this. He wasn't here to pick a fight. He was here to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Dorian could feel the unease in the air, the tension thickening as passengers looked between the gate agent and him. And then it happened. Haley turned to speak with another colleague, her voice low, her words carrying just enough for Dorian to hear. "Do you know who he is?" the colleague asked, her voice incredulous. "That's Dorian Brandt. His company just signed a major deal with Horizon. We're working with him." Dorian's heartbeat quickened, not in surprise but in recognition of how close they had come to the edge. Haley froze, her face drained of color as the realization hit her. She didn't know who she was dealing with. Not really. And now it was too late to undo the damage. Without a word, Dorian took a slow step forward, not toward the desk but to the large glass window overlooking the runway. He folded his arms behind his back, staring at the endless stretch of tarmac. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't anxious. He was simply waiting for the moment when they would have no choice but to face the truth of what they had done. And in that stillness, Dorian knew that this wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about something much larger, a quiet revolution in how people like him, like all people, should be treated. It was about how the world needs to see people, not as assumptions or stereotypes, but as individuals, equal, deserving of respect regardless of the seat they occupy. Dorian stood there, unmoving, watching the bustling activity of the airport through the glass wall. The noise from the terminal felt like it was miles away, as if the entire world had receded, leaving him in a vacuum. But in the midst of the chaos, a steady underlying pressure was building, one he knew well. It was the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would make people take notice. Not because of who he was, but because of what his presence demanded. He didn't feel anger. Not yet, anyway. Instead, there was a simmering disappointment. Disappointment in a system that still operated on outdated assumptions. They thought, he was just another businessman in a suit, Another name on a boarding pass they could dismiss. But he wasn't, and they were about to find out why. As the minutes passed, Dorian's phone rang again. This time it was Maggie. Her voice was calm but edged with urgency. They've escalated it. Corporate's aware now. They're moving fast. Are you okay? He exhaled slowly. I'm fine. Just keep them on the line. This is their chance to fix. Dude, let's see how they respond. In that moment, Dorian wasn't just standing in a busy terminal. He was standing at the crossroads of something much larger. He could feel it in the air, the shift in the power dynamic, the turning of the wheel. What had begun as a simple act of denial had now become a symbol, a moment that would ripple out far beyond the gates of JFK. Haley had returned to her desk, her face pale. She glanced at Dorian once more, the realization dawning on her like a heavy weight. She wasn't dealing with a regular passenger. She was dealing with a man who had the power to make this all go away, or escalate it into something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. Dorian's calm gaze locked with hers, and for a brief moment, he saw the fear flicker in her eyes. The power of the moment wasn't in his words. It was in his silence. Haley couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had been creeping over her since the moment she looked up and saw Dorian standing there, calm and composed, his boarding pass still in his hand. It had been a long day already, and now, standing in front of him, she felt like she was out of her depth. She had seen many passengers in her time at JFK, but this one was different. He didn't look like the typical first-class flyer. He didn't look like anyone who belonged in that exclusive lane. The nagging feeling in her stomach twisted as she glanced at Dorian again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't making a scene. In fact, he wasn't doing anything at all. He stood quietly, observing, waiting. But there was something about him that unsettled her more than if he had been shouting or demanding answers. His calmness was unnerving. There was a quiet power in his presence that made her feel smaller, as though she had made a mistake, but wasn't sure how to fix it. Behind the counter, she could hear the low murmurs of the growing crowd. Some passengers were impatient, others curious. One man, standing near the front of the line, leaned forward to whisper to his companion, "What's going on? Why is the flight delayed?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Haley couldn't shake the unease she felt as the words echoed. In her mind, what was really going on here? She turned to Mia, her colleague who had been standing next to her, watching the scene unfold. Mia's posture was stiff, her arms crossed, but there was a different energy in her demeanor now. It wasn't just about the job anymore. Mia wasn't looking at Dorian with suspicion or doubt. There was a strange recognition in her eyes, a moment of clarity that hit too late. "Haley," Mia whispered, her voice low but urgent. "You know who that is, right?" Haley blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. "What do you mean? He's just some businessman." Mia shook her head, her voice quiet but sharp with concern. "No, he's Dorian Brandt, the CEO of Brandt Global Foods. His company supplies most of the fresh produce for Horizon's flights. I saw the contract on the vendor list last week." Haley's stomach dropped. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt her face flush, her heart rate quickening. She wasn't just dealing with a typical first-class passenger. She was dealing with a man who was, in essence, the backbone of Horizon's entire food service initiative. She had seen his company's name on the vendor list, but she had never imagined it could be him. The weight of the mistake settled over her. It was all coming into focus now, her hesitation, the questioning, the unnecessary escalation. It wasn't just about denying a seat anymore. It was about a man who could bring an entire corporation to its knees with a single phone call. And there she was, stuck in a moment of misjudgment, unable to undo the damage. But even as the realization hit, Haley didn't know how to fix it. The gate was still buzzing with uncertainty, and Dorian was still standing there, his face unreadable, his phone now back in his pocket. She felt small in comparison, caught between trying to maintain control of the situation and knowing that everything she had done so far was wrong. The air felt thick, every second stretching longer than the last. It was at that moment that she heard a sharp voice cut through the tension. A man in a navy suit, his Horizon ID badge clipped to his chest, approached the gate. Behind him, a woman in red heels spoke urgently into her phone, her face pinched with concern. Cynthia Reyes, the executive director of regional operations, stepped forward, her presence commanding the space around her. Dorian's calm gaze shifted toward her as she approached, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Cynthia's approach wasn't just a sign of authority, it was a signal that something far bigger was about to unfold. Haley froze, her breath catching in her throat. She watched as Dorian met Cynthia's gaze, his face still composed, but his eyes sharp with the quiet intensity that had started this whole chain of events. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all. He had known this moment would come. He had known they would finally have to face the truth of what had happened. He wasn't just a man denied boarding on a flight. He was the man who had power in places they didn't even understand. Cynthia extended her hand to Dorian, her tone professional but softer than before. "Mr. Brandt, I'm Cynthia Reyes. I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. Please allow me to escort you onto the flight." But Dorian didn't take her hand immediately. Instead, he raised an eyebrow slightly, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Do you know what seat I was assigned?" Cynthia checked her tablet, her fingers quickly tapping on the screen. "Seat 1A, she replied. He let out a small, knowing smile. "Interesting. I was told this lane was for premium passengers only." Cynthia didn't flinch, but Haley could see the unease in her eyes now. The weight of the situation was settling in, and Cynthia knew, just like everyone else, that Dorian wasn't just a businessman. He was the force that could reshape the way they saw the world. Haley stood there, watching it all unfold, feeling like an outsider in her own world. She had made a mistake, a costly one, and now it was up to Dorian to decide how it would end. But as she watched him take a quiet, measured step forward, she realized something. It wasn't about the apology. It wasn't about the seat or the flight. It was about the power of a moment, one that she would never forget, a lesson that had burned itself into her memory. Cynthia Reyes stood still for a moment, her outstretched hand hovering in the air, but Dorian didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, more than any apology could. The reality of the situation was settling on Cynthia's shoulders like an invisible weight. This wasn't just an issue about an isolated incident at a gate. This was about perception, about a moment that would ripple across her company, through the ranks and into the broader world. Dorian's calm gaze never wavered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even disappointed, not outwardly. But inside, the tension was mounting. He had worked too hard for this moment to let it be dismissed with an empty apology. He'd spent years, decades proving himself, silently building a global empire, dealing with the subtle indignities, the silent racism, and the prejudice that constantly tried to limit him. But this was different. This wasn't just another small indignity. This was a public, undeniable error, one that had to be addressed. "You don't have to apologize," Dorian said, his voice low but cutting through the tension in the seat. "I'm not here for an apology, Cynthia. You think I'm here for a seat? No, I'm here for something much bigger." His words were like a spark. They ignited something in the air between them. A shift that made Cynthia's carefully composed demeanor crack just slightly. Behind her, the other Horizon staff members were watching closely now, their expressions tense as they realized what was happening. The shift in the dynamic was palpable. Dorian wasn't just a passenger. He was a force, and they had no idea how powerful that force could be. "Mr. Brandt, Cynthia began, but Dorian cut her off before she could finish. "I'm not interested in hearing another corporate apology, Cynthia," he said, his words deliberate. "You think this is about the mistake you made with today? It's not. This is about something deeper. It's about the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass without knowing the full story. I didn't deserve to be treated like this, not because of my ticket or my status, but because I'm a black man in a world that still questions my place in it. The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Cynthia's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her features. This wasn't just about one bad day at the gate. This was about a pattern that ran deep within the airline's culture and, by extension, within the world. But Dorian wasn't done. "You think this is the only time this happens?" he continued, his voice rising with quiet intensity. "How many others have been humiliated in the same way, made to feel like they didn't belong, made to prove their worth over and over again? I've been through this my entire life, and I'll be damned if I let this slide just because you're sorry now." Haley, standing a few feet away, felt her heart race in her chest. She was still in shock, still trying to process what was happening. She had been so focused on following procedure, on maintaining order, that she hadn't stopped to think about the larger implications of her actions. She hadn't considered the weight of what she was doing until now. The weight of a life built on hard work and integrity being questioned with a glance, a suspicion, a misjudgment. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. It was as though time had stopped, and everything around her, the gate, the passengers, the noise of the terminal had faded into the background. All that mattered now was Dorian, and what he was saying. Cynthia's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't reach for it. She was too focused on Dorian, on the man who had just laid bare the truth they'd all been too afraid to confront. The truth about how, in one moment, everything could change. How one misstep, one moment of doubt, could lead to a domino effect that had consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined. "I don't expect you to understand everything in this moment," Dorian said, his voice softening just a fraction. "But I expect you to listen. I've worked my entire life for this, for my business, for my family, and for my people. And I will not stand here and let anyone, especially a company I helped build, dismiss me like I'm nothing. Not anymore. I'm done being invisible." The words struck like thunder, reverberating in the air. The weight of them was undeniable, and it was clear that Cynthia, the others standing nearby, and even the passengers who had been waiting for their flight, were beginning to understand something bigger than just a man being denied boarding. They were witnessing the breaking of a cycle of underestimation, of prejudice, of silence. Cynthia's expression hardened as she finally reached for her phone. She tapped the screen quickly, her fingers moving faster now. She didn't look at Dorian when she spoke again. "We're initiating a full review of our internal training procedures," she said, her voice firm, but far less certain than it had been. "And we'll ensure that all of our staff undergoes sensitivity training. This will never happen again." Dorian nodded slowly, but his eyes never left hers. "That's a start. But it's not enough. You don't just change a culture with a few training sessions. You change it by making sure people like me never have to experience this in the first place." For a long moment, the air was thick with unspoken words. Haley could feel the gravity of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had been part of the problem, but now she saw the solution was within her grasp. It wasn't enough to apologize. She had to do more. She had to change, to grow. Dorian turned his attention back to the gate where the boarding process had come to a sudden, awkward halt. "I'll be boarding now," he said, his voice calm again, but carrying an undercurrent, a finality. He turned to leave but then paused as if considering something. He glanced back at Haley. "And Haley," he said, his tone soft but firm, "remember that next time. Don't let your assumptions define who I am, and don't let them define who anyone else is either." Haley stood there, frozen as Dorian walked away, escorted by Cynthia and the other Horizon staff. It was a quiet moment, but it held more weight than any apology or explanation could ever carry. And in that moment, Haley knew her life and the world she operated in had just been forever changed. The incident at Gate 17 wasn't just a fleeting moment of discomfort. It was a powerful reminder of the ongoing work needed to combat the subtle yet pervasive prejudices that still exist in our society, even in places that pride themselves on being progressive and inclusive. In a world that increasingly champions diversity, equality, and inclusion, moments like these show us that the work is far from over, but more importantly, they remind us that each of us has a role to play in shifting the narrative. The lesson from Dorian's experience isn't about the apology or the policies Horizon Air is now forced to implement. It's about recognition, recognizing that assumptions based on appearance, status, or background can influence how we treat others, often without us even realizing it. For Dorian, his story is not just about being a successful CEO. It's about the journey of a Black man navigating systems that weren't designed with him in mind, constantly having to prove his worth, often in silence. This is where the value lies, in recognizing the power of silent strength and resilience. Dorian didn't scream, didn't demand apologies, or make grandiose threats. He simply stood there, calm and unwavering, and allowed the truth of the situation to unfold. The real power in his response wasn't in his words. It was in his ability to remain composed, to let the wheels of justice turn without giving in to the impulse of anger or frustration. And in doing so, he set a precedent that one doesn't have to shout to be heard, and one doesn't have to fight fire with fire to make a real impact. Sometimes the loudest action is the quietest one. For those of us watching, the lesson is clear. Every day we're faced with opportunities to challenge the assumptions that others make about us or about people around us. Whether it's in the workplace, in social interactions, or in casual moments of judgment, we need to ask ourselves, am I seeing this person for who they really are, or am I letting stereotypes cloud my perception? In today's society, particularly in the United States, where discussions about race, power, and privilege are at the forefront of national conversations, it's crucial to understand how often subtle biases, unconscious or not, can shape our behavior. In many cases, they shape our responses to people we perceive as different, or those who may not fit the traditional mold of success or societal acceptance. Whether it's a Black CEO being questioned at an airport or a woman trying to break into a male-dominated field, we all experience these subtle forms of discrimination. And the worst part? Most of the time, those who are doing the discriminating don't even realize it. This is where systemic change is needed, not just in laws or policies, but in how we educate ourselves and each other. It's about learning to question our assumptions, about confronting uncomfortable truths, and about having the courage to listen when others share their stories. For those in positions of power, especially in business and corporate settings, Dorian's story is a call to action. It's a reminder that companies are not just responsible for profits. They are responsible for the environment they create for their employees and customers. What happened at Gate 17 wasn't just about one individual misjudging another. It was a systemic failure that reflected a lack of awareness and sensitivity. And in today's world, no company can afford to ignore that. We are living in an era where information is accessible at our fingertips, where social media gives voices to the voiceless, and where societal norms are shifting toward a more inclusive and empathetic approach. The onus is on each of us, whether we're in positions of leadership or not, to embrace these changes and take ownership of how we treat those around us. We must actively engage in the uncomfortable work of unpacking our biases and be open to the possibility that we don't always get it right. Dorian's experience teaches us that real change isn't just about lofty ideals or grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday decisions we make, the microaggressions we allow, and the ways we choose to see each other. The culture we want to build, a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect, begins with the smallest acts of recognition. It starts with listening to those around us, hearing their stories, and acknowledging the weight they carry. It starts with us doing better, being better. In the modern context of the United States, where diversity is celebrated but often not fully integrated into the fabric of everyday life, Dorian's story serves as a poignant reminder that progress doesn't just happen. It's something we must actively pursue, by questioning our assumptions, changing our behaviors, and standing up when we see injustice, no matter how subtle it may seem. Ultimately, the lesson here is one of accountability. Accountability not just to the people we see as different, but to ourselves, to make sure that we are always striving to do better, to be better, and to lift each other up. In this ever-evolving world, we all have a role to play in creating a more just, more inclusive society. It's time to listen. It's time to learn. It's time to act.